everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, this is going to be a fun one. This topic has been a long time coming. You've heard about it on the show before. Hppd. We're joined by Ed Prideaux. Shit, did I do that right? Prideaux?
Prideaux.
Perfect. Prideaux. Great. Thank you. We are here to talk about Hppd and a film that, Ed, you've been working on for a bit. And the trailer was stunning. But let's not get into it too much yet. Let's talk about you first. So you're in England, Brighton, a little bit south of London on the coast there. What else is important to know about you in relation to this film project or Hppd?
Right, so I've been interested in psychedelics for a long time, and it's one of my specialisms in my own journalism and writing. And then maybe about a year ago, I got involved with an organization called the Perception Restoration Foundation, part of whose work is this new documentary called Stuck in a Distorted World, which will be about primarily the severe end of Hppd experiences. There's other work that the PRF is involved with in kind of raising funds and organizing studies, but I guess I got involved with the PRF and Hppd work because I myself have lived with perceptual changes, Hppd, whatever you want to call it, for 6 years following an LSD trip. And I'll actually be commencing a kind of research-led master's from January into Hppd. Because it's such a wide open, under-researched field that I felt like the best thing if I wanted to make a meaningful contribution was, getting in the weeds, getting in the deep end.
Right. Like you've really gone into it. And like, I think that's a great way to be active and really engage in the topic. So, Hppd, hallucinogen perception or persistent disorder or something like that. Hallucination, perception, persistent disorder.
Persisting perception disorder.
Persisting perception disorder. And this is a legitimate DSM diagnosis from what I understand, though quite rare. And our co-founder here, Kyle Buller, has experienced this. He's talked about it on the show. A lot of trails, a lot of like inability to drive at night for an extended period of time. So, it does happen. And people kind of pretend it's fake often. We actually recorded with Dr. Torsten Passy, who's a pretty famous German doctor and researcher. He said it's trauma reactivation. I'm like, that doesn't sound specific enough, and it doesn't sound like it understands the neurology enough for that to be like an explanation, right? That's kind of like really shallow. I might be, reiterating what he said incorrectly, so go listen to that episode, people. But can we talk about like what happened for you, Ed? Were you at a festival or something and just it never stopped, or what? How did that play out?
Yeah, so I guess like some portion of the psychedelic community, I got interested in tripping young, and I decided to follow through on it young as well. So I was 17, my fourth trip in 3 months, although my fourth trip was my second in 2 weeks. So I took 200 micrograms with a couple of friends whilst my parents were out of town, or 200 micrograms of LSD, and had, actually 1p LSD to be precise, but I believe that speculatively it's believed to kind of hydrolyze into just straight LSD in the system. Had a pretty trying, unpleasant, but still occasionally fun experience. Didn't sleep. I suppose at points mildly traumatic, but I suppose the real mild or trauma came when I was kind of caught by my parents on the long come down of the trip, and was severely told off. And I think that something we'll get into is that I think that the triggers for Hppd, it's not just psychedelics, it's psychedelics in the context in which the psychedelics were taken and in which you re-entered into sobriety. And I think that trigger, my parents having caught me not being able to integrate and process the experience, probably at least didn't help in why on the following Monday at school, I noticed essentially visual snow on the carpet. and I was sure I'd never seen this kind of phenomenon before. Or people, even normal people who've never taken drugs, can experience visual snow, but this seemed very new
Can you
to me.
describe it?
Sure. So visual snow. I mean, the name. I mean, as the name is fairly imprecise, but it gets at how in in the air or on blank surfaces, carpets, rugs, walls, the sky, you can see basically just kind of fields of like speckly, grayish, grainy dots, and it can range in severity. For me, uh, at the moment, at this point in my life, it's kind of pretty mild and just a kind of very surface level, like mild graininess that's on my vision. But some people, like their entire visual field is just soaked in these dots. Um, and so to return to kind of my origin story with HGPD, I looked down at the carpet, I noticed these little sparkles. And then kind of as the week progressed, the visuals only seemed to come on and accelerate and become more aggressive to the point where kind of at the peak of my HGPD experience, which kind of seemed to peak together with the anxiety and worry about what I'd done to myself. Like it'd be pretty intense. So kind of set one scene. I remember lots of experiences where I'd be in my living room with my parents who had no idea what I was going through. I'd look at my dad, I'd look away, and his like a complete after image of kind of his
Mm.
silhouette would linger in the air for several seconds. Walls would morph. I'd see faint geometric patterns on the floor and on surfaces at school. Uh, surfaces, walls, carpets. They would melt and move waxily, kind of like I was in a kind of semi psychedelic state. There'd be times when I glance over at the carpet and there would be faint mandalas and kaleidoscopes on it. And then
Wow.
when I got to university about a year later, especially in lectures where kind of it's part of the lecture experience, right, to kind of be focused on the lecturer in front. And I feel like that focusing kind of like any kind of psychedelic visual intensifies and kind of seems to focus the presentation. So in those lectures, it would be like I would develop tunnel vision, where kind of on the kind of borders of my visual field, it would be soaked in a kind of kaleidoscopic fuzzing effect. Um, and I remember one particular lecture, right, and I'm not sure what contributed contextually to it being so kind of extreme. I would almost be blind by how much fuzzing and tunneling there was going on. And I suppose the worst bit, we can get into this later, the worst effect of these visual changes, it wasn't so much anxiety about what I'd done, it was just the sheer sense of isolation that I, like, as if I was stuck in my own, essentially mini broken perceptual world that I just too freaked out to tell any of my friends or family about. And now I have, and now I'm obviously public, but for years, I never told anyone outside of maybe 2 or 3 friends. Um, so it's been a pretty strange experience, and nowadays it's thankfully returned to being like a fairly mild baseline condition. But again, for years, it was pretty noticeable, pretty tangible in my everyday life.
Mm. That's really interesting. Okay. Um, that idea, like I'll get that kind of visual distortion once in a while, but I have to be in like the right geographic position. For instance, like too much. You familiar with Gansfield effect? Have you heard of this term? Um,
No, please tell me.
yeah. So this is happens in snow blindness, but they can recreate it in the lab by cutting ping pong balls in half, and you get a fair amount of visual hallucination or like just kind of strange input as a result of there being kind of a single stimuli across the whole visual field, like white, for instance. So I'll get it in the woods or on top of a mountain where I'm getting like a lot of really wild visual stimulus, but it's certainly nowhere close to what you're describing. So this is like, persistent. Like it doesn't necessarily matter, if you're in the middle of a blizzard or not. It could be happening if you're chilling out on a couch or in class. Like that's a lot. Um, and was it distressing? Like often another, for lack of a gentle term, they call it comorbidity, I guess. Like what, Was there other stuff going on for you at the same time beyond this?
Uh, yeah, I guess from the outset, the direct distress of these perceptual changes was probably with me for about a year, like probably most intensely for the first month or two after it came on. Um, but it was more a lingering, subtle form of distress from the isolating effects. And it's funny, like the role of distress is a complicated one with these perceptual changes because according to the DSM-5, HPPD is only clinically diagnosable if there's distress. But for many people, if you scan online communities beyond like the HPPD subreddit, for example, lots of people report these kind of perceptual changes, but don't find them distressing. And so I feel like one area I'd like to contribute to, possibly in my master's research, is kind of creating a framework for perceptual changes that aren't HPPD. And so a phrase that's kind of a label that I've been playing around with is just straight post-drug perceptual changes, like PDPCs. So this is a space for people to be like, yeah, I've experienced visual weirdnesses after I tripped, and it's not been distressing. I mean, some people actually love them. And I think that reserves the clear diagnostic space for HPPD. In terms of comorbidities, yeah, I think that the primary comorbidity I'm interested in is depersonalization, derealization, which, according to one small survey, I think it was 25 HPPD patients I saw, 90+% experience this comorbidity. And I think that for some portion of HPPD patients, like the depersonalization aspect is like it's symptomatic of an underlying pathology of which the HPPD is itself also symptomatic. And so for me, I have experienced depersonalization, and that has been definitely a greater source of distress than just perceptual weirdness. Like it's a direct, it's like, so for listeners that aren't aware, like depersonalization, derealization, it kind of describes an experience in which you feel like kind of radically cut off from your own body and the contents of your immediate experience, and also just like the outside world. Like things just lose their intuitive sense of realness. And this for me kind of it's correlated with background stress. And during probably the most stressful week of my life, when I was graduating from university, also doing finals, trying to find a job desperately, like the dissociation, just like the depersonalization, just like kicked in like a motherfucker, really. And for about a week, like I kind of just had like constant anxiety and constant depersonalization, which again I didn't tell anyone about because I was too scared that I seemed like I was some kind of casualty. I didn't want to. And I think it's just intrinsically weird to kind of tell your mum and dad that the world just doesn't seem real right now. You don't seem real, and I think that's. I kind of feel like there's just such a category gap that we just lack a language to talk about that kind of experience.
Right. Well, we can thank psychedelics for bringing it back, but it's also like
Yeah,
forcing us to really confront a lot of things.
yeah,
It's yeah, we've had many, say at least 1,000 years of pretty boring religion in the West, right? And now all of a sudden we have this new way of experiencing the world, divinity, whatever, nature, and it's going to challenge a lot of these categories. It seemed pretty firm, and bring in new ones that we don't even know how to talk about yet, right? So yeah, as a younger person, not necessarily having a ton of life experience, right? Like you're not 50, right? So like at that point you kind of have some shit you've gone through and you can speak to it. Maybe you read a bunch or whatever, but early 20s or late teens, like you can't really expect too much out of young folks like that to be able to
yeah,
handle these massive existential problems.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that brings to mind a few things. I think the first is that, like, there are different ways of expressing things like depersonalization that aren't necessarily like pathological. So if you were to take a kind of like really hardline pathological psychiatric lens, I mean, ego death, selflessness, the kind of beautiful beatific phenomena you can experience on psychedelics are sometimes called depersonalization. Meditators will experience so-called depersonalization. So I feel like a real framework needs to be developed where, on the one hand, yes, we can play with these unusual experiences, but in a way where they're adaptive. And on the other hand, where there's real stress, where actually, rather than connecting you to the world, you're more cut off from it than ever before. And that's where depersonalization comes in. And yeah, you're right. The youth, my youth and the youth of many HPPD sufferers is certainly not helpful. I mean, if you scan the forums, it seems that I'd estimate the majority of people online seem to have got this when they're like teenagers. And some of the most panicked posts I see, it's really tragic, is like even 14-year-olds just posting, what the fuck? I took acid with some friends and and the world doesn't seem real. I'm seeing shit. What do I do? And it's really quite tragic to see.
Yeah.
And I guess it doesn't help that, when you're at that early age, you have the developing brain, but you also have a kind of a reduced ability to balance risk, but also such a curiosity. Uh, and to be honest, I don't regret any of my psychedelic experiences, and I think that there's almost an argument you can make for having these young, because for me, I feel like I was able to bypass or just like jump over some of the nonsense that might have accompanied my path from having these experiences young. But at the same time, I think there's an inherent risk in like going along this path young. Yeah.
There's no simple answer here, right? It's
No.
and you mentioned meditation earlier, and I want to make sure people understand this. Like, it's certainly possible to meditate and to end up in a psychiatric hospital unit. Like, Vipassana meditation, beautiful meditation practice. I love it. But people can get hospitalized after. So like, it's not just psychedelics. There's a lot of things we can do to manipulate the mind and psyche to put ourselves in really tough spots, not just drugs. Yeah. So, cool. So you started then kind of bumping into a number of other people that were distressed, or how did you kind of get the curiosity to dive into the film?
Right. So it kind of all started when I wrote an article for The Independent, the British newspaper, about HCPD. And this got me connected with the folks from the Neurosensory Research Foundation, which is another non-profit that I don't work with. And then I got hooked up through them with one of the founders of the Perception Restoration Foundation, which is producing this film. And so for about a year, most of my work with the PRF was directly producing this film, but it's been parked for now, so where I can, and the work will be resumed on it, hopefully for an early release in 2022. So my work with the PRF at the moment has been directly on awareness raising, and kind of harm reduction work. Something I was working on today was finalizing a first pass of like a fairly comprehensive information guide on HPPD, of which I believe there has never really been a previous attempt, that I hope to circulate kind of amongst the research and clinical community. And MAPS' Zendo project has expressed interest in kind of adding their branding and doing a kind of joint release, which is
excellent.
which is promising. And kind of, rather than just like basically like say, I mean, HPPD is little known in depth, even by many psychedelic scientists. But rather than just complaining about it, I felt that I could use my skills to just try and solve it, which is what we're doing with the PRF. And rather than minimization and stigma and denial, I've experienced nothing but open-mindedness, kind-heartedness, and willingness to understand from everyone I've spoken to on the issue. I mean, the only minimization I've seen has been on Reddit. And I remember I posted a link to my independent article on the Joe Rogan subreddit, because I thought, these guys like psychedelics, they'll find this interesting. But I saw nothing but, yeah, bro, this is just dare flashback propaganda. This is bullshit, which is unfortunate, but to be expected, because HPPD is weird. It's probably quite rare, and it does kind of like piggyback on, or at least is unfortunately tied to flashback ideas, which like at the very least are just problematic and like can be tied with literal bullshit, like the spinal fluid idea, which people still get taught. Like I
It's
have a friend,
unbelievable.
I have a friend who, she's same age as me, and when she was at school, she was being taught the idea that LSD is stored in your spinal fluid, and it's unbelievable how this stuff carries on. But I think that HPPD is precisely an issue where you can do a balanced, real harm reduction education program, right? It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
bullshit.
That's interesting. Yeah, like that flashback concept is really brutal because, of course we know that that's largely bullshit, but we also know that it just in the popular imagination, HPPD and flashback sound like the same thing somehow. And that's just kind of how, yeah, a lot of people just get confused, I guess, can't handle that level of complexity maybe. Um, or, we just need to keep telling the story. Like, you did a great thing here and started working on this film with some others. And, no spoilers here yet from me at least, but, there's some really impressive people that you're able to pick up for the film.
Yeah, yeah,
Who I had no clue were sufferers.
right.
Yeah, that was brutal to really watch and go, okay, like there's a lot here that I don't understand, and there's a lot more people, even important people, for lack of a better word, that are really going through some shit too.
Yeah, yeah. I guess you're alluding to the all gas no brakes journalist Andrew Callahan, who is featured in the film. He has a pretty funny story about the trip that set off his HVPD, but I guess it wasn't so funny when he woke up the next day. And I think it's been 10 years for him now, has had like pretty severe HPPD. Um, and yeah, I guess the story, the film, if anything, it really, as you say, it's a delicate issue, and you don't want to just sound the alarm, so to speak, in too blanket or too extreme a way, because indulging like fear mongering narratives in a way is self defeating, because what we care about with HGPD is the distress it causes. Like if people's perceptual changes aren't a problem, they're not a problem, and if you make out that these perceptual changes just have to be this like awful, imprisoning, distorting, life destroying experience, then that makes it so for people, especially impressionable
Right.
teenagers. But we wanted the documentary to focus on that subset of HPPD patients whose lives have legitimately been ruined, especially those especially those people for whom a kind of reframing or a kind of an integration just won't work, at least a lot of the time, because the visual changes are so extreme. Like
Right.
through my kind of friendships in the HPD community, you do come across people who, and I've no idea what proportion of the community they account for, but honestly, they are disabled by their HPPD, for lack of a better term. Like, I got speaking to a guy recently who's in his mid 40s, took acid in the mid 90s as a teenager, and he early 90s, and to this day, like the visuals have never lessened in intensity. They're as extreme as you can imagine, and like he has to live on welfare. He can't hold down meaningful relationships, a job. He has to sleep with a light on because in the dark the visuals are just too extreme. And so it's these severe cases that I think that they tell us that this issue can't, like, even if it's rare, that the fact that these experiences can be so severe and so distressing, like, they justify themselves in their importance, I'd argue.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And, you know, it's literally speaking, I believe, an orphan disorder. Like that, it's so rare that it gets minimal attention, and I believe it deserves attention because psychedelics, not because people deserve care when we have care to give them, right? But really, psychedelic consumption is only going up. There's no turning this thing around, and we need to do some research to see, like, can we prevent this? Is this Do we need to start abstinence education on psychedelics again for the youth? I kind of don't think so. But, how do we get people safe or heal them after they've had an issue like this? I've spent a lot of time with 4 or 5 people talking at length about kicking off a treatment protocol, like a lightweight kind of trial, non-drug interventions, neurostim, neurofeedback type stuff. And we just never really got there. A number of reasons led to that, but we were, 2 weeks out from raising money to kick this thing off and just couldn't figure it out. But still an interest on our side. Do you know if people are actually experimenting with treatments right now, Ed?
Well, the one that immediately comes to mind is a very promising intervention I heard about recently was neurovision therapy, whose details I'm not conversant in, but this is a treatment protocol for people with visual snow syndrome, which is a condition with huge overlap with Hppd. It seems like, at least in some Hppd cases, really it's just a case of drug-induced visual snow syndrome. And neurovision therapy, from what I was told by the head of the nonprofit that's been organizing and funding it, it shows radical success.
Oh, wow.
And visual snow syndrome, look at the symptoms. I mean, you look at the name, and the visual snow, one of the overlaps, but also halos, after images, more traditional psychedelic effects that just seem totally HGPD. But people with VSS, visual snow syndrome, they can just wake up one day with this. It can be spontaneous onset. I mean, I even read of one case of a guy who was at a hot yoga class, put an ice pack on his face, I guess over his eyelids as well. And when he took it away, he had VSS. It's such a strange, bizarre condition. But either way, in neurovision therapy, and the PRF is organized a study via Macquarie University in Australia that will be doing deep neuroimaging of HCPD patients. And the hope is that kind of by seeing just at the very least what the neurophysiological correlates are, if there are across HPD patients you can generalize, and that lays the groundwork down the line for some kind of targeted treatments. But like you, I think that looking outside of pharmacology, looking outside of just direct take a pill and hopefully your HCPD goes down, is interesting. And something I want to explore in my master's program is psychological psychotherapeutic work, because I sense that there is that a lot of the problem for HCPD patients is the anxiety it provokes, and I think that psychological interventions can obviously help to bring down the anxiety, and I think that anxiety can fuel the intensity of visuals as well. Terry Krebs, who's a Norwegian psychedelic scientist you might be aware of, she pointed me to research which showed that people with just generalized anxiety disorders can experience very similar visual changes. And then anxiety kind of other impacts, by just making you more prone to obsessive fixation. And then anxiety, that could be a symptom, as Torsten Passy kind of as you described, the anxiety could be symptomatic of how trauma has played a role in this. Trauma could be triggering both the anxiety and the visuals as all part of the same package. And that's where I think that psychological healing could play a real role.
Right. I've got this kind of model in my mind around kind of overstimulation. It just gets stuck in this hyperactive loop, right? The whole nervous system, and therefore the visual system is getting kind of flooded with data, just maybe leakage of some kind. Who knows? This is Joe's hacked bro science. But it's helpful, but people need to downregulate regularly. So like, could, for instance, say you were doing float tanks, talk therapy, like 2 to 4 hour ketamine infusions to like super duper downreg the nervous system, or like high dose CBD nightly for 2-3 weeks. Like, could that downregulate the nervous system enough to like help it kind of regain some sort of equilibrium, right? Like, could it? Like, it's a great question. I don't know the answer. Relatively safe things to test, but as people want it done right now. And
Right.
are they willing to be patient and like deal with science? Like, I think regularly the answer is no. Like, I'm not patient enough to want to deal with the scientific method. I think that's
No,
just kind of a chronic
yeah.
problem in our space, right?
Yeah. No, I think that you're hitting the nail on the head there. I think that downregulation, those kind of interventions, could be extremely helpful. They make me think of a few things. Like, one, like with HCPD, since the issue is basically pretty under researched, you can only speculate. But kind of one model that I think makes so much sense is kind of drawing in Robin Carhart Harris's kind of entropic brain rebus model, where psychedelics, they disrupt, shake up the snow globe of your your categories, your cognitive categories, and that includes your perceptual categories. And so it seems that for some people, kind of the snow globe, the snow just doesn't settle in the right way. And I feel like some kind of intervention to maybe even re-increase neuroplasticity, so the snow globe can reset, is something that deserves a look. Especially since some people report just like spontaneously, if they take another psychedelic, the visual changes just go away. So I've seen reports online of people who took LSD, woke up the next day and it was gone. You mentioned ketamine, same there. I heard of a case of, I was told about this by John Halpern, who was a collaborator of Torsten Passy, of a guy
You've
who
communicated with Halpern?
he was being interviewed for the documentary. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and he described a case to me of a gentleman who developed severe HCPD, I believe after an ayahuasca experience, and then a subsequent like extremely healing ayahuasca experience made it all go away. And I think, and explaining how that can happen, I think that you might have the neurophysiological angle, where psychedelics neuroplasticity can kind of work both ways with HPPD, and also the psychological angle of the trauma angle, how with a particularly healing psychedelic experience, your nervous system, your emotional states, it can reprocess a lot of stuff, a lot of energy that had been expressing itself in HPPD. And to kind of close that loop, Stan Groff, who I assume many listeners rather, will be familiar with, like he writes about, although the term hadn't been introduced at the time, but he writes about HCPD in his book LSD and Psychotherapy from 1978. And he describes patients who had been administered LSD as part of his program, who had the after images, the visuals, all the classic stuff. And his intervention was to, I can only assume, a highly controlled, highly observed setting to re-administer LSD, and in his language to resurface and then reintegrate the unconscious material that had been presenting itself as HPPD. So in his like psychodynamic model, HPPD was the unintegrated unconscious, and some people will resonate with that kind of explanation, others won't. But yeah, there's all sorts of ways of looking at HPPD, kind of some or all of which will be helpful for different people.
So we're pretty heavy duty Groff people here at Psychedelics Today. And I think there was a case where I don't know if this is an HPPD case. I don't think it is, but this one person, Groff was such a believer in those clinical days that he issued, I think, over 100 treatments to this one person. And eventually it worked, and they were totally legit and back to normal. Mind blowing that somebody, number one, would have that much belief and faith in the process, and like this kind of post-Freudian psychodynamic model of like, yeah, it's the material needs to process and complete. If you've got like these kind of spinning loops out there still, like there can be some problems from that. Yeah, it's and you never know what those problems are going to be, right? It's so unpredictable, I think, from the Groff frame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you for that. It's always a treat to talk about Groff. So we might actually get him and his wife on pretty soon. Actually, I'm really excited.
Oh wow!
So stay tuned. Yeah. So yeah. Well, this is good to know. So there are so many different slices, right, of how we might understand such a complex thing. There's so many, in contemporary science is only friendly to a couple ways of looking at it. And it's an interesting thing. Like, do you, what's giving you the most hope right now around the HPPD topic? Is it your work on the film? Is it any kind of researchers doing anything in particular?
The film is, it gives me, it will, I think the hope will have to wait till it'll be finalized and released. What's given me the most hope is how there's so much low-hanging fruit to be plucked in terms of just like plugging like a knowledge gap, so to speak, in the psychedelic community around HPPD, that you can make a lot of advances around this territory quite quickly, which I hope I've contributed to. And then combine with how open-minded, as I've mentioned earlier, people have been to talking about this issue. And just connecting with other people in the HPPD community and realizing that, that there are people, there are others out there who, and we're working hard to address this. And in terms of my own personal experience, I guess, and I'm not sure this would resonate for other HPPD experiencing people. Like, I guess what helps me process it is just the realization that psychedelics, they produce weirdness, and it's not to be, and their capacity to induce weirdness in the perceptual space, in terms of just what you see after a trip. I think that kind of perhaps needs to be normalized. A kind of like perspective, like weird naturalism, Eric Davis style, of just realizing, hey, yeah, I'm experiencing some visual weirdness after a trip, and I've also had weird thoughts after a trip, and perhaps they can be packaged as part of the same phenomenon, and then connected with that, ideas of neurodiversity, I think are important to emphasize here. Kind of taking a critical psychiatry lens, realizing that lots of people hear voices, and it's not necessarily bad for them. In fact, it can be adaptive for them. So kind of just realizing that, there's the psyche.
Is that a thing, critical psychiatry? I've not heard that phrase before. And I like
critical psychiatry. Yeah.
What are we... Are we going Marxist here with psychiatry, or what are we doing when we say critical psychiatry?
Right. Well, there will be Marxist flavors of critical psychiatry, but critical psychiatry, although I'm not an expert, basically, as far as I can see it, its basic perspective is, on the surface level, to criticize the strict pathologizing biomedical lenses that psychiatry can take, like particularly as expressed in the DSM-5, and then alongside, although I think the DSM-5, I don't want to be too critical because it's kind of helped put HPPD on the map, and a lot of psychiatrists kind of can use it but not let it use them. But yes.
So it's a way of kind of saying anti-psychiatry, but it's like, it's better than anti-psychiatry in that psychiatry is important. Like, it's an important field. It's really, we want to improve it. That's how, like, I kind of identify as that a little bit, because I've talked to so many folks with, intractable problems, and, the scientific basis for psychiatry is a little shaky, and we need to really firm that up. And, I just say, let's improve the science. Let's improve the practice. Let's not lie and suggest that there aren't problems, right? There are problems here. Yeah. So that's kind of how I like to land on that. Does that seem a little in line with it? Yeah.
I would agree. I guess on the more radical end, you have people like Thomas Shash, I believe is his name, and he wrote a famous book.
Thomas Saz, SZAZ or something like
yeah,
that. Right?
Yeah. And he wrote the book, The Myth of Mental Illness, which some people on the more radical end of critical psychiatry would agree with. But I guess the one that I'm most aligned with is just the idea that you can reframe phenomena that might tend to be pathologized, like hearing voices, like having unusual visual experiences, like having radical peak experiences that might ordinarily be considered symptoms of schizophrenia. But a lot of noise has been made about how you can take a cross-cultural perspective on schizophrenia and realize that for one person, their schizophrenia symptoms are are pathological symptoms of a brain disease. But for other people, they're part of the package for maybe a different, more spiritual attunement with the world. And you can take these kind of perspectives lightly, but I think that they point at an important thing. And to take the HPPD issue in particular, I've read accounts online of people who have reframed their kind of post-drug perceptual changes, if I can use my own new coinage, like, for example, as insights into the inherent fuzziness and liquid nature of reality. Like, I've seen people say, "Hey, you think I see." As part of their perceptual changes, they literally see like the borders of objects wafting and act in a kind of liquid way, and they're like, "Hey, you really think that tables and chairs are static objects? Of course they aren't." And other people have kind of taken it in a more like artistic sense. So I've seen people say, "Yeah, my so-called HPPD has been the greatest source of creative inspiration I've ever experienced. Like, I'll close my eyes and I'm just met with beautiful visuals." I've seen a description of people staring out of windows for half an hour each day, and with their HPPD experience, they can just watch a dance of clouds, which it sounds freaky and it sounds weird, and I'm not sure what more conservative-minded people would think of that. You take LSD, but I think that's not to be judged, and good for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like in schizophrenia, like there's a fair amount of the population that are having these and can reframe their relationship to what they see or experience such that they're not that stressed out about that little guy down there that keeps threatening to stab them or whatever it is, right? It's like there's a total and really interesting reframe of the human experience that I find really interesting. Probably get crucified for saying something like that, but the fact that somebody can say, okay, yeah, I diagnosed schizophrenic or whatever it is, and I'm actually okay with my symptoms. There's some correlates here with the neurodivergence movement, like in the psychedelics and autism scene, or just various forms of like, autism activists. It's like some people are very much okay with their, what straight culture would call a diagnosis, right? They're just, this is just how I am and I like it. I would never ever want to be another way, right? So there's going to be poles of that, right? I wish I was never autistic, or I wish I never had HPPD ever, but other people are really thankful for it. It's like a really interesting frame, right?
Yeah, and some people, like, even if they don't necessarily enjoy their HPPD experience, they are still grateful that they got HPPD, so to speak, because it motivated lifestyle changes that they would not otherwise have done. So, for example, someone might have been taking a lot of acid, a lot of different drugs, neglecting fitness, neglecting healthy eating, and then they wake up with HPPD, and kind of the only way that they can work through this experience is these lifestyle changes. So you see people saying, I'm actually pretty glad I got HPD because I've come out of this healthier than I otherwise would have, and
Glad,
kind of,
wild.
yeah. And other people, it makes me think. Mention people who are kind of just okay with, for example, if they had like an auditory hallucination of someone telling them to hurt other people. But I was listening to a really fascinating interview on Will Hall's podcast, and Will Hall being the guy who wrote the piece for
We've
Mad in
had him
America.
write actually a bunch about his I learned a lot about him based on his backstory there. Blogs and podcasts, check him out. I
Yeah,
regularly forget he has his own channels.
yeah. I really respect Will Hall, and he interviewed a woman who kind of who learned to work with her auditory hallucinations. So her framing was, why are my voices so critical? Why are they so mean? And so her framing was, so she, rather than just seeking to shut down, muffle, uh, eradicate her auditory hallucinations, started listening to them and realizing that the particularly negative, stigmatizing flavor they took was a symptom of, like, for example, trauma. Um, and I think that perhaps for some HPD patients, you can take a similar spin. You can try and lean into HPD, perhaps in terms of, what was that psychedelic experience that triggered it. Like, for example, if it followed a particularly traumatic or challenging trip, rather than just running away from HPD, could you lean into it and try and look really in the granular fine details of how your HPD presents? What are the emotional triggers? When does it surface and why? In the wider context of the trip that caused it, and in that sense, it can be something to be run towards rather than run away from. But that will only apply for some people, and you can't generalize. But yeah.
It's true. Yeah. Huh. I really appreciate this perspective. All right, so I want to talk about your film for a little bit here. So watching the trailer, it had these really like dark and ominous overtones,
Mm,
right? And
yeah.
I couldn't help go like kind of getting triggered a little bit, going like, oh shit, is this like another drug war thing? Or am I gonna have to like fight this in a weird way or something? And like, I think you can understand why, right? Like, but I don't want to say it was totally justified, like because I understand how much people are suffering, and I'm like, I don't want to push back because I think it's important that they get this word out. But is this going to freak out, you know, American middle class to the point where it slows down psychedelic progress a bunch? Like, is Fox News going to grab this and Rupert Murdoch's going to go like, I told you, like, that's the kind of reaction I had. But I'm like, this is an essential conversation and essential education for the psychedelic space, and it's finally here. Because I've not really ever seen a book on it. We've seen some papers, right? But we've never really seen like good narrative storytelling.
Hmm. Yeah. And I'll emphasize that as we finish up, kind of the storyline and framing of the film, like we will emphasize that, and even the title, "Stuck in a Distorted World," like this is reserved for people with like bona fide, legitimate diagnostic HPPD who, like, for lack of a better phrase, like are stuck in a distorted world. And as I kind of emphasized earlier in the conversation, the reason why it's dark and ominous is to convey that this is an extremely dark and ominous condition that can affect people. And like, even if it's not distressing for most people who get it, like it can be so distressing for them that, like, uh, they need help, really. Like, they need a voice, especially since, like, there's something of a survivorship bias in the psychedelic community, I feel, where the people who are like active, vocal, engaged are precisely going to be these kinds of people who weren't just like essentially taken out by their psychedelic experiences. And so I think that, I don't want to be a savior guy here, but these severe HPD cases have, for the longest time, been essentially left voiceless. And I hope that this film will be the voice and mouthpiece for them.
Yeah. I like that sentiment. Thanks for that. It's yeah, like it how many people, and you know this better than me, have the experience of trying to talk to people about this and being called a liar, or like, no, you're not experiencing that, or things along those lines. Have you run into stuff like that?
Well, I guess you can take, in terms of directly being accused of being a liar. Yeah, I was talking to a guy who's pretty senior in the HPD community. Senior in the sense that he's like behind, he's like a big name in like the forums, etc. And like his mother didn't believe that he had HPD for years. Like she was denialist against him. But I guess there are different flavors of minimization that can appear. Like on the one hand, you might have clinical professionals who have never heard of the condition or claim it's in your head, or they might be misdiagnosed with drug-induced psychosis, got schizophrenia, and like I think that was especially an issue in the 70s, 80s, 90s when HPD was little known, and just it seems like it's all there on paper. You have someone who's taken LSD, a young man, and he's now experiencing visual hallucinations. He tells me this is classic drug-induced psychosis. This is LSD-induced schizophrenia, for example, and they need to be put on antipsychotics. And then another flavor will be, as I had mentioned earlier, the sense that like this is just classic flashback propaganda. And I think that there's a subtle minimization that can occur when HPPD is it's treated as an issue that doesn't really matter because it's just rare. Um, and and I think that's problematic for reasons I've already mentioned, kind of with the severity of experience some people can have. But also, I think that's problematic because we don't actually know how common HCPD is. Like the idea of severe HCPD, like the cases we cover in the documentary, like undoubtedly that is going to be a very minority experience. But the idea that you can have essentially, post-drug perceptual changes that may be at the very least mildly distressing, like I'm not sure it necessarily is going to be that rare as we look into the research. Like Matt Baggett did this survey in 2011 together with Erowid, which found, based on a poll of, I believe, 2,500 psychedelic users, and you can obviously criticize like this or suggest there could be sampling bias here, and kind of its survey samples from Erowid, which isn't gonna be representative of most people. But either way, 4.2% of that sample, so that's about 1 in 25, experienced like distressing HPPD. And 4.2% seems small, but then when you realize that's 1 in 25, it's not that small. So I guess at the very least, the conclusion I'm drawing is like we just need to research how common this actually is.
1 in 20. Can you go back to that 1 in 25 figure? Like what
Yeah.
is that again?
That is, so according to Matt Baggett's and Erowid's survey, that they found that I believe 25% of the sample, which again is problematic, but at the same time, 25% experienced some kind of permanent perceptual change from their psychedelic experiences. And then 1 in 25, so 4.2%, found these perceptual changes distressing. And I think that in the survey, um, it was not just distressing, but so distressing that they were seeking or were considering seeking clinical help, which is diagnostic HPPD.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. Okay. Um, yeah, it really makes me wonder. Like obviously we need to do a few more of these studies to find out, the rarity, or like, is it actually HPPD, or did shit just get weird for 2 days or something? But when do you know offhand know the criteria? Is it like 5 days? Is it like 2 days? I don't know offhand.
There's no specification. I mean, I what comes to mind is a case report of a guy who was diagnosed with HCPD 20 years after his last psychedelic experience. And one interpretation is that is clearly ridiculous and shows how just because you're experiencing a weird visual and you happen to have taken a psychedelic, it seems all too easy to just say, oh, this is HPPD. But on the other hand, I think it's possibly suggestive that at least for some HPPD cases, like there could be some strange like dormancy effects at play, where like it's already clear how HPPD it's not just psychedelic. It's not just psychedelic drugs. It's psychedelic drugs in an appropriate context, and it really could be that some people, they set something off latently, and then with the right broader contextual trigger, even years later, it can set off HPPD. And I think that an interesting contextual trigger to explore here is like the role of cannabis. Like how some people, like they can have like a fairly normal cannabis relationship, and after they, lots of people experience this, how cannabis seems to be different after they've tripped. Like it becomes a more psychedelic drug, and
Right.
some people, they have a normal relationship with cannabis and then they trip, and then somewhere down the line with just maybe a cannabis experience that I assume was unusual in itself, like maybe it was more, maybe it was quite an anxious, paranoid experience, then they wake up the next day with HPPD. And even the role of cannabis itself as a trigger isn't to be underestimated. I think that there was a poll of the HPPD subreddit which found that cannabis was the second leading direct cause, LSD being the leading cause. So cannabis isn't to be underestimated here.
That's really interesting. Um, so who are some of the top names right now who are interested in this or working on it? Any names
Mm,
we might know?
mm. Um, well, someone who has a very considered balanced perspective is Terry Krebs, who knows the ins and outs of the HCP literature and has always been a great source of advice here. Uh, Torsten Passy, and John Halpin's work I cite a lot because it emphasizes the psychological drivers of HCPD, more than just like neurophysiology, which I think is important. Dr. Henry Abraham, who is now retired, but for years was the world's leading, if only, authority on HCPD. Someone who is a frequent collaborator with Passy and Halpern was Arturo Lerner, who is, I believe, an Israeli psychiatrist who's done a lot of work on this. And then people like David Kozin, who's one of the moderators of the HCPD online community, and he's been like really active in the
We tried to
HCPD
get him
space.
on the podcast for years and years, by the way. Just never
Oh,
flew
really?
for some reason.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. David David has been very hard at work on the HPD stuff, and he's still putting together. Um, I think what promises to be like the complete list, the complete bibliography of every HPD paper ever published, which will be a very useful resource for people. Um, and outside of that, like Michael Sobeck, who is from Ambria Capital, and he's helping out with the Perception Restoration Foundation. Um, I guess these are the key players to watch.
Well, that's really good to know. Cool. I'm glad there's finally some attention here, right? This has been a long time coming. Um, it's been, as a non-sufferer, like, not particularly hard for me, but it's also, I know how hard it is for people with it, to get through their day. Like when Kyle would describe his symptoms and how long it impacted him for, it's kind of like, oh shit, like I finally know one of these fringe cases personally. And that's really fascinating to me. Yeah.
And it's also instructive that, like, Kyle, obviously, although I'm not going to speak for him, like his HGPD experience didn't turn him off psychedelics. Like, obviously not. So you can have a and I think and for me, after I developed HGPD, I took a year off essentially all drugs other than an occasional cannabis edible, uh, and then I started re-experimenting with psychedelics. I just took a risk and had amazing trips, and those kind of university trips after I left school are kind of the reason why I'm here today and the reason why I work around psychedelics. And I was blessed that these didn't exaggerate my HPPD, at least not for any more than 1 or 2 weeks. And I have thankfully a mild case today. So you can still have a profitable relationship with psychedelics, even if you have perceptual changes or even a distressing HPPD case. And like many people in the HPPD community, part of the reason why it's distressing is the sense that you can never trip again, because you can develop HPPD clearly after good trips, and you can wake up and think, "Fuck, I'm never going to be able to trip again." And that's one of the biggest questions that gets asked on the HPPD subreddit is, "Will I ever be able to trip again?" And you see unfortunate cases where some people then start asking, "Will I be able to take just drugs in general again? If so, what drugs should I take?" And then you get some people asking whether they should take opiates. Like, "Hey, I'm going to a party, obviously can't like trip or smoke weed anymore, so should I just like take some oxys?" Which is concerning, especially since like these kind of downer drugs, they can help with HPPD symptoms. Like they can lessen the intensity of visuals. They obviously reduce the anxiety, and so self medication is it can be a big issue for people with HPPD. Like Dr. Henry Abraham, who I mentioned earlier, through his clinical work, he estimated that 1/3 of the HPPD patients he saw had some kind of problematic relationship with alcohol, because alcohol, especially for those with the severe visual presentation, the alcohol finally gave them a break. It's just with the hangover, it would often bounce back in a more intense way, just kind of creating this real vicious cycle, of self medication and just an ever worsening condition.
Yeah. Hmm. And anything you want to say about like this concept of novel or kind of research chemicals being a big part of this? Like, or do we just not even know enough to comment? Because Kyle was commenting on DOI recently from this study he was reading up on, saying maybe what I had wasn't LSD because the experience was so different from a classical LSD experience.
No, I think that that's certainly something to be explored in the research, and I think it might be a partial explanation for why it's not appearing in clinical trials. Although I think there are a few reasons for that. But either way, I mean, my HPPD experience, as I mentioned earlier, was triggered by 1p-LSD, and 1p-LSD might not be the best case study to use here.
Yeah, I consider that
yeah,
almost exactly LSD. Like,
yeah,
I
okay,
hate to say it like that, but it's like just too close, right?
yeah,
Um, right. So for those who don't know, it's kind of like the prodrug for LSD. As soon as it goes inside, it kind of quickly converts into LSD. Um, right.
but 25
So
I and stuff. Like I've read
two
accounts
five
online of
I
people.
N bomb is
Yeah,
terrifying.
yeah. I saw a
People still
guy who was
die
like,
from it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I saw a guy who was like, yeah, I took dozens of LSD and mushroom trips, took 25 I once, and woke up with HGPD, and he was like, let's guess what was responsible here, or
Right.
or even just beyond direct novel psychoactives, just the problem that like MDMA in particular, which can also trigger HCPD, is often like significantly overdosed in pills, and so you can have an extremely overwhelming experience, or you can kind of venture into neurotoxic territory uh, through street MDMA because there's too much of it.
Sure can. Right. UK, like the pills, people need to understand how strong the pills are in different places, like and how you really don't know how strong a pill is. But in the UK, like there's different drug laws than in the States, where I believe folks are charged on quantity of pills, not theoretical weight, right? So they make pills stronger to work around the regulations. So it puts the users at a lot of risk because often they don't know. Like education isn't available. Education's been suppressed. So
Yeah,
what do we do?
yeah, definitely. I
Um,
mean, yeah, the pills, and I've actually never taken MDMA, but I've you can read a lot online about people that have just died because these pills are like, what, 500 milligrams, which is
Right.
crazy.
It's a lot. It's a real lot. You know, and it's tough. And really, there's no way to know because it's not a safe supply. Like we don't have kind of GMP MDMA available on the street yet. And like once we do, people can be a lot safer because it's like, okay, yes, I can drink 2 of these beers and I'll be fine. It's like, okay, I can have 1 of these pills and I know I'll be fine. Like I'll be easily recovered tomorrow and can still at least do a light work day or something crazy like that. But we don't have that now. We have like, you know, unreliable manufacture, distribution, etc. So it's a big problem and we need to figure that out in order to reduce harm. In my opinion, I could be wrong, but people should always try to challenge me.
I think you're definitely right. Actually, just quickly on the clinical trials issue, something that I've been thinking about is obviously the clinical trials have been like overwhelmingly with psilocybin, and it seems that psilocybin, whilst it can trigger HCPD, is way less implicated than LSD. And I think that there's something about LSD that lends itself to HCPD because the experience is so long. And I think that if you were to take a neuropsychological...
I think you're right.
Yeah. I think if you were to take a neuropsychological lens, like one interpretation I've seen is that the LSD experience is so intense and so long, and the come down so extensive that you're training your brain for like 12 plus hours in a basically in like in a mode of psychedelic perception, whereas for psilocybin it might be like what 6 to 8, of which the peak, you know, is what 1 to 2. And so I think that perhaps as LSD is explored more, like if and when in these clinical trials, you might see it more. And I saw a recent write-up in the Psychedelic Science Review, which found that I've forgotten the percentage, but it was something. It was a non-trivial percentage experienced. I think just maybe 2 or 3 days of lingering visual phenomena. So I think that's to be explored. The role of LSD in particular, and then to zoom out and return to the issue of contaminated drugs. I think that I think part of the HCPD problem is our culture's entire warped relationship with drugs, in particular in creating the conditions for the sense of isolation and self-shame that can come with HCPD. And so, like, I didn't come out to my family for 5 years about my HCPD, and part of that was you don't want to, because I couldn't tell teachers at school, because that would literally be just tying the noose around my neck for me getting kicked out. Like, people at my school were kicked out for possessing weed. Bam, you're out. If I'd come out even to my, some of my the teachers with whom I had the friendliest relationships, if I'd gone, hey, I'm experiencing this weird shit since I took this drug. I'm really getting really stressed out. I would have been reported and kicked out. I couldn't tell my parents because, on the one hand, I didn't want to be an ambassador I didn't want to indulge an anti-drug narrative, because, like, in taking LSD like that, that's quite a radical rejection of like your parents' whole like life philosophy, and you want to justify it. You don't want to lose your grip on the deep experiences it can give for you. And so if you came out and said, hey, I'm actually having trouble from my LSD trips, it would seem to detract from like the case for psychedelics you've been giving them. And it would just make it all too easy for them to go, you should have listened to us, you shouldn't have taken LSD. And then zooming out further, like the self-shame that comes with HCPD. Like, people with visual snow syndrome, who I mentioned earlier, this other condition you can get that's very similar, that can happen without drugs. Like that seems to lend itself much more to most people's empathy and compassion. Like, you just wake up one day and it's just there. Whereas if, you did this to yourself and with drugs, like, it seems to be that there's limited room for empathy. It's just like, yeah, you're a druggie, and this is what you did to yourself. You fried your brain, And then, the brain frying thing is, I think it's a huge source of self stigma for people with HPPD. Like, I definitely experienced it myself in the first year after I developed the condition. Like, yeah, I'm a basket case. I'm an acid casualty. And I think that all of these really needlessly self-shaming, um, incredibly negative and unpleasant narratives people tell themselves just are allowed to fester in a culture where we can't have open conversations about the risks and benefits of drugs.
Agreed. Yeah. Like that's hmm. Well, yeah, that's a really interesting way to even look at it. Diehards not wanting to admit it because they might be seen as wrong. That's fascinating, and I can see how problematic that can be. I wonder. The Reddit groups are famous for being like a roller coaster of emotions and like in really intense reports and anger and everything in between, right? Compassion to lashing out. And makes me wonder if a lot of that comes from just straight conflict internally in these folks because they wanted to believe and they did maybe, but where did it get them?
Yeah, definitely,
It's a tough
especially
one.
in the current environment we're in with the psychedelic renaissance. Like, we're in a delicate, pivotal time for psychedelics, and obviously this is psychologizing for other people and projections playing a role here. But I think people can feel self conscious about coming out and saying, "Hey, yeah, I have actually been having some difficulty from my trips," because they don't want to spoil the fun, they don't want to derail the train, and I think there's all sorts of risks alongside HPPD that people don't talk about enough. And I would point listeners to a really amazing lecture that was at the 2019 Breaking Convention conference by a cognitive scientist called Marta. I'm going to butcher her surname, Kamarichik, I believe. And she makes the point that, uh, depersonalization, post trip mania, post trip anxiety and hyperarousal, and HPPD, all these sorts of issues have been pretty neglected in the research. And that owes as much to any psychedelic toxic positivity is just like the sheer shutdown in research. Like, the shutdown affected research into their therapeutic benefits, but also their costs. And people can be reluctant to talk about them because, they also just don't want to. These experiences are very meaningful, and it makes sense in a culture where everything seems to be stripped of meaning in this fairly soulless society we seem to occupy, that we don't want to lose belief in this quite promising thing, psychedelics.
Right. Hmm. Cool. So, Ed, I think we need to wrap up here. Is there anything you want to leave us with on the tail end?
Uh, I would, well, first I would urge, if any HPPD patients are listening, to head over to the PRF website, and the URL is literally just perception.foundation, where you'll find links to the studies that are active right now. And the one that you can participate in right now is a questionnaire study run by Macquarie University, where basically just fill in your experiences. It'll take only 15 minutes. What is HGPD for you? Because we need to just plug the data gap around what HGPD even is and what it even feels like for people that experience it. And any Australian HGPD patients listening, especially near the Sydney area, can register for this neuroimaging study. Um, and then it's more broadly just keep track of the PRF's work, keep track of the documentary, which work will resume in earnest shortly, due for release early 2022. And if you want to follow my work, just head over to my Twitter. I'm not too active, but try and be active where I can if I have things interesting to share.
Excellent. Well, Ed, I really appreciate that. What's the name of the documentary?
Stuck in a Distorted World.
Perfect. And hopefully early 2022. I can't wait to watch the full thing. Maybe we can partner up on some sort of release or something. But let's stay in touch here. This is a really interesting and important topic. I hope people learned a bunch about HPPD here, and hopefully we can start making some progress and help a lot of people.
Definitely, that is the
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah.
Right,
Thanks for your
cheers, Joe.
time, Ed. And until next time.